The dashboard clock read almost midnight when Lucas entered the road known as the Highway of Perdition. The nickname wasn't official, but everyone in the region knew the sinister reputation of that stretch. For miles, the road twisted through a dense forest, where the darkness seemed to swallow every hint of light. The car's headlights illuminated only a few meters ahead, revealing uneven asphalt and towering trees that stood like silent sentinels. The radio was off, but the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of branches in the wind created an unsettling atmosphere. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly. He had heard the stories, whispers about mysterious disappearances and inexplicable encounters that haunted that path. But to him, they were just urban legends meant to scare unwary drivers. He was tired after a long work meeting, eager to get home, and those tales were nothing more than distractions. Still, when the GPS recalculated the route 3 times, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. As he passed a rusty sign that read, "Caution, accident risk," Lucas remembered something he had heard years ago. A tragic accident involving a bus full of workers that never reached its destination. The case had sparked rumors and conspiracy theories, but he had dismissed it all as exaggeration. Even so, as he drove on, the road seemed to take on a life of its own, each curve narrower and more sinister. Suddenly, the radio turned on by itself, emitting a brief static before tuning into a station. A broadcaster's voice echoed, "This is a replay from 1982. Tonight we revisit the mystery of the Highway of Perdition." Lucas frowned, feeling a chill run down his spine. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the atmosphere around him suggested otherwise. The radio continued to play a broadcast about the Highway of Perdition, recounting the disappearances that marked the location's history. Lucas tried to turn it off, but the button didn't respond. He turned the volume to 0, but the announcer's voice persisted, as though echoing directly inside the car. Drivers reported strange sightings, figures on the road, murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. Lucas shook his head, trying to push aside the growing discomfort. Then he saw it. Up ahead at the roadside, a motionless figure appeared in the headlights' glow. It was a man, dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying a small backpack. He raised his thumb, hitchhiking. Lucas slowed down instinctively, but an inner voice screamed at him to keep driving. This isn't a good idea, he thought. But something in the man's expression, a mix of desperation and serenity, made him stop. The man opened the door and stepped in without a word, only nodding in gratitude. He appeared to be in his 50s, with disheveled hair and hollow eyes that avoided direct contact. "Thank you," he murmured finally, his voice hoarse. Lucas gave a brief nod in response, trying to ignore the sudden chill that filled the car. For several minutes, silence hung thick between them. Lucas tried to make conversation. "Where are you headed?" The man looked out the window, gazing into the darkness beyond. "Wherever you take me," he replied enigmatically. The discomfort grew with each passing mile. Lucas began noticing details he couldn't explain. The smell of damp earth, as if someone had brought forest soil into the car. The rearview mirror, which seemed to show a distorted silhouette in the back seat, even though no one else was there. The man started murmuring something inaudible, as if talking to himself. Lucas tried to ignore it, but the words grew clearer. "They never arrive. Always come back. Trapped." Before Lucas could ask what he meant, the GPS shut off completely, and the dashboard lights flickered as if losing power. A shiver ran up Lucas's spine. The sense that something was profoundly wrong was impossible to ignore. The silence in the car became suffocating. Lucas tried to rationalize what was happening. GPS issues, electrical malfunctions, maybe exhaustion. But none of that explained the persistent smell of damp earth or the hitchhiker's strange behavior. He glanced at the man briefly, but the hitchhiker seemed oblivious to the tension, staring blankly ahead. "Have you heard about the people who disappear on this road?" the hitchhiker asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice seemed distant, almost as if coming from somewhere beyond the car. Lucas hesitated before responding, his throat dry. "Yeah, I've heard stories, but I think they're just urban legends." The man let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Legends? Is that what you think? That it's all made up?" He slowly turned his head, his hollow eyes now locked on Lucas. They didn't disappear. They're here. Trapped. Like me. A chill ran down Lucas's spine. He tried to laugh nervously, but the sense of danger was undeniable. "Like you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The hitchhiker didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pointed to the car's dashboard, which began flickering again. On the radio, the static broke into whispered voices, indistinct but filled with despair. What's happening?" Lucas stammered, his voice trembling. He tried to press the brake pedal, but it didn't respond. "Do you think you can escape?" the man muttered. "No one escapes this road. No one." As he spoke, something began to change in the hitchhiker's appearance. His hands, once normal, now showed burns, as though they had been scorched. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, mixed with a sharp, acrid scent of smoke. "Who are you?" Lucas shouted, panic evident in his voice. The man leaned slightly closer, his eyes now glowing with a pale, unnatural light. "I'm what's left," he said coldly. "Just like the others. Lost. Forgotten. And you'll be next." Lucas tried to steer the car off the road, but the highway seemed endless, trapped in a loop. The scenery around him remained unchanged. Dark trees, an empty sky, and that awful smell. Suddenly, the man began to fade, as though made of mist. But before vanishing completely, he whispered one final sentence. "We're almost there." And then the passenger seat was empty once more. The radio turned off, and the car finally obeyed Lucas's commands. He slammed on the brakes, the engine dying with a gasp. Trembling, Lucas took a deep breath. But before he could process what had just happened, he noticed something on the passenger seat. A small pocket watch, engraved with the year 1982. Lucas stared at the pocket watch in his trembling hands. The inscription 1982 gleamed faintly under the dim dashboard light. He knew that year wasn't a coincidence. It was the same he had heard on the radio earlier. The year of the tragic bus accident on the Highway of Perdition. A chill coursed through his body as he opened the watch, revealing hands frozen at 11:59 p.m. Suddenly, a wave of vertigo swept over him. The air grew heavy and his vision darkened. When he regained his senses, he was no longer in his car. He now stood in the middle of the road. But something was different. The road looked newer, with no cracks in the asphalt, and the trees, once foreboding, now had lush green leaves. Confused, he looked around and saw the lights of a bus approaching in the distance. Lucas tried to step aside, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground was holding him in place. As the bus passed him, the scene changed again. He was now inside the vehicle, seated next to a young woman holding a bouquet of flowers. The bus was packed, filled with tired workers and quiet conversations. The woman beside him smiled at him. "You're late," she said, her voice sweet but tinged with something unsettling, as if slightly out of sync with reality. Lucas tried to reply, but no words came out. The bus driver, a burly man wearing a cap, shouted something unintelligible before the vehicle took a sharp turn. Then Lucas saw it. Ahead, a dense fog blanketed the road, and the headlights couldn't penetrate it. The bus entered the fog, and chaos erupted immediately. Screams filled the air. The vehicle lost control, and the sound of twisting metal was deafening. Lucas felt the impact as if he were really there. The pain was real, and the panic around him was overwhelming. He saw desperate faces, hands trying to break open windows that wouldn't budge, and the driver shouting orders no one could hear. Then, the bus came to an abrupt stop. The fog lifted, and Lucas found himself back on the road, now surrounded by lifeless bodies on the ground. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, and he quickly turned around. It was the hitchhiker, the man he had picked up earlier, now standing by the wrecked bus. "Now you understand?" the man asked, his voice heavy with sorrow. "We're all trapped here, reliving this moment until the road chooses who's next." Lucas tried to speak, but before he could, the vision faded, and he was back in his car. The pocket watch was still in his hand, but now it read 12 a.m. Lucas blinked several times, trying to process what had just happened. He was back in the car, but something felt wrong. The road ahead looked exactly the same as before, as if he had never left. The pocket watch was still in his hand, But when he glanced at the dashboard, he noticed the engine was off, and the GPS showed only a blank map with no roads or coordinates. He opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cold air against his skin. The smell of damp earth lingered, stronger than ever. Looking around, he saw that the surroundings were unchanged. Tall trees lining the road, and a pitch-black sky with no stars or moon. He walked a few steps, trying to make sense of his location, but was interrupted by the sound of footsteps emerging from the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. Lucas stepped back toward the car but froze when he saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was the hitchhiker. He was smiling now, a cold, empty smile, as if he knew something Lucas didn't. "You thought you could escape?" the man asked, tilting his head slightly. "No one escapes this road. You belong to it now." Lucas tried to get back into the car, but it vanished before his eyes, leaving him alone in the darkness. He felt the ground beneath him begin to give way, as though the road itself was dissolving. In a final act of desperation, he screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the void. Days later, a truck driver found Lucas's car abandoned at the roadside. On the passenger seat lay the small pocket watch, its hands still frozen at 12 a.m. Thank you for joining us on this chilling ride through the shadows of America's roads. If you crave more spine-tingling tales from the dark asphalt, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support keeps these haunting stories alive. Stay tuned, because on these roads, the next nightmare is always just a mile away. Welcome to Asphalt Horror.